David's going to tell us about the Fairwater riparian corridor rehabilitation. And my understanding, David, is this is part of a development process. So, those other ones were obviously councils doing their own works, but yours is a developer-led process. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes, that is. So yes, this project was a project driven by development of a former golf course site in Western Sydney, and as part of that, there was the removal of a 1 kilometre section of concrete channel. And in that sense, it was an opportunistic project. It wasn't strategic in the sense that it wasn't identified as a particularly important waterway, but as part of the project and a 6-star Green Star development, the developer and council were very supportive of getting better outcomes. And I was part of the design team, and I'll just acknowledge that two of the key design team partners on this, Phil Coxell and Julio Manrique, as well as Frasers and Blacktown City Council, who are ultimate asset owners. And as I mentioned, this was an opportunistic project, and that got us reflecting on what we were doing and why. And at the very beginning of the project, it was a sense of questioning, I guess, what we were trying to achieve. And I just want to take you through some of our kind of musings, I guess, as part of the design team about, how we got to where we got to and why, because that fundamentally set up the direction for the project and what we ended up delivering. So one of the key things that we're kind of feeling on, in particular, we're reading this book that had just been put out by a local historian who worked on the Cooks River and the history of the Cooks River. And he was talking about predominantly post-colonial history of the Cooks River and how rivers are these ideas that they're socially and culturally produced in the way that we think and interact with rivers, and the way that we particularly physically interact with rivers. The changes that we make are based on the set of cultural ideas that exist at the time. And in particular, he ran through the history of these different dominant ideas, from industrialization and turning it into canals and visions and dreams of grand canals and waterways that enabled shipping and boating, through to more bucolic and residential dreams of country living in the 19th century, and this pastoral ideal kind of ideas that are imported from England at the time. But also, as this landscape developed, this idea of then it becomes more residential, it becomes more middle class and suburban, this kind of idea of these village garden landscapes. And he highlights really well just this idea that what we pick up when we actually approach design, and the way that we approach what we're going to actually do in terms of restoration. If we pick up our project and say, what are we actually going to do and reproduce in this? The idea that you're not independent of that cultural and social context that you come from. And in particular, he kind of throws out this challenge, I guess, and I think this was really something that we kind of thought and reflected on. He kind of throws this challenge as well, because he says that have we really broken with that past, or is it just a continuation of this desire to control the river and bend it to a human aesthetic? And he kind of questions whether these new dreams for restoration that we currently put up, are they actually any different to these previous 19th and 20th century ideals? So that was kind of one underpinning of the way that we approached it and thought about this particular project. The second was a project, again, at the time, that was just something that we had reflected on and were thinking about in a very different context. This is in Geneva in Switzerland, and just a visually stunning project where the designers for this were really conscious that it's kind of a useless effort to design a fixed riverbed when a river loves to design itself, and that's what it does. It's a natural system. And so they proposed this series of incredible diamond-shaped systems, beds, that were then kind of cut through with these channels, very geometric forms to start with, but then let the river design itself. This idea of these artificial interventions, but also this interplay between a natural system as well. This idea, this folly that are we actually really designing the river, or is the river designing itself, was something that we were thinking about. This idea of what's fixed, what's not fixed, what do we control, what do we don't control. And this just shows this idea of this change, this idea of dynamic change. So the design intervention in this case was this idea that that we're not necessarily designing the fixed outcome. We're not designing the ultimate outcome. The river is doing that itself. It's got this concept of this living being as well that Corey was kind of talking to as well. This idea that as much as you can, even though this is a straitjacket system, there is an element of self-design in this process of a living system. So the third underpinning in terms of the approach that we kind of took, and again, just one of these things in terms of the design process that was influencing us, and this ideas that were kind of milling around as we embarked on a design process and design ideas, was a whole bunch of bushwalks through, various natural creek systems that we had undertaken at the time. One of these was Bungonia Creek in southwest of Sydney, beautiful, relatively natural creek system. And we're really interested in this interplay of these geometric forms and the fact that when you look at a river, it has all these different forms. It doesn't have this kind of typical cross section that meanders and changes. It has a whole series of interplays of different kind of components and elements, almost by random. And so this idea of this interplay of the geology and the way that geology is geometric, this kind of layering of the past geological forms, but then this folding of the landscape to turn this vertical that then becomes part of the creek bed. And we had pinned these photos up, and these were kind of like the design inspirations, I guess, for us on our pin board. These were kind of the key things that we kept coming back to, was this kind of the beauty, I guess, of these geometric forms that we saw in these kind of our own reflections and musings on natural systems, waterways and creeks. And then the final bit was this kind of, if I kind of borrow from a Christian idea of rapture, this idea of being on a waterway, this idea of that it's a feeling as well. It's a space that's like no other. And you can kind of, capture this here if I reflect on this photo, this idea of pausing on that riverbank, having a break from the walk, throwing stones into the river. It's this feeling as much as this space as well of being on the river. So that was kind of the philosophical underpinnings of kind of the things that were floating around of our kind of conscious space as we took this into, a design process. We had a fairly heavily urbanized context. So this gives you a space where we are. We're kind of in the middle of Sydney, middle of development, 30 kilometers from the coastline, but in classic 1960s, 1970s suburbia. And our project was the developer had purchased this golf course and was redeveloping that as a mixture of single dwelling and multi-use dwellings. And we had a concrete lined channel on the western side of our site. And the developer was really interested and really keen, and Bucktown Council were really supportive of a new future for this concrete channel as part of this development, this opportunistic approach of saying, well, it's going to be concrete channel both upstream and downstream, but there's an opportunity here to do something. So the context for us was kind of almost a folly in and of itself. Like, how do you create this natural system in between these two concrete line channels that were upstream and downstream and would remain upstream and downstream? Council had no plans, no funding to replace the concrete line channel. So our section of restoration was going to be sitting in between, this context either side. So there was an element of deliberation about what we were actually trying to do in terms of the approach that took forward. And this deliberation, this consciousness of the fact that we were designing something artificial, something that was intent for natural, but something that had this intent of also for us telling stories, reflecting on what rivers are and what they can be in a landscape. So we didn't necessarily think of this as an ecological garden at the time. It's probably something that we've then, placed over the top. But I want to kind of just highlight, I guess, not so much all of the elements, but just a few elements of how we approach kind of these design ideas, these approaches to telling stories, and what we're trying to achieve through some of the things that we did in terms of this approach that kind of reflected on those three underpinnings for this project. The first was that we wanted to kind of leave this cultural remnant, of what we had done to waterways and not erase it. We didn't want to erase the fact that at this point in time, we thought it was acceptable to remove waterways and concrete them and replace them with these trapezoidal channels. And we kind of wanted to also comment on this in the sense of we wanted to deliberately pockmark this channel and kind of give a sense of what we thought of this approach of concreting channels, and to allow this then to become its own space. And then in this context of planting out these pockmarked pieces and allowing some to be planted, but some to just be these own self-driven kind of waterway places, you can kind of see the underpinning between this and the River Air project, the influence between this idea of allowing the river to kind of, allowing the creek in this instance to drive its own form and its own change. This idea of scarring the landscape, but allowing it to some elements of it to remain, to tell that history of what was there previously. The second idea that we had, and we saw this a lot in our own explorations of waterway restorations that have been undertaken in Western Sydney, a lot of the approach was taken to just leaving the bed as one uniform plane on the base. And when this happens, what we saw quite quickly was this development of typha filled channels. And so there was no form to these waterways. They had sandstone beds and then typha throughout the base. And it was totally created by this intent to naturalize, but this kind of lack of finesse, lack of understanding, lack of consideration for how you could get different planting in there related to the ecohydrology of the waterway. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to, rather than just having this typha field based channel of this waterway, we wanted to create these series of beds and different levels and let the ecohydrology, let the waterway kind of determine what vegetation and what components would drive, based on this idea of creating the classic low flow channel, but also creating this idea of these dry garden beds planted up that wouldn't allow typha to grow, wouldn't create the conditions to typha to grow, but also these geometric wet gardens as well. So we had this tapestry of different levels. And then the underpinning of this as well, that idea of these places of rapture, we wanted to bring people down to this creek, but we did it in this way that was kind of, how do you actually engage with it with an urban waterway that has flood flows going through it? This channel conveyed the 1 in 100. How do you do that in a way that is safe, that doesn't necessarily create um, uh, a space where people used it for a pathway, but were invited down? We had this path that comes down to it, but then we're directly connected to these concrete channels that were part of the formation that kind of invited this exploration of coming down into this waterway, experiencing this waterway. If you think of that sense of coming down to that waterway and that sense of rapture, we understand this is going to be an urban waterway, but this sense of inviting coming down to this and providing these informal pathways to walk that waterway, to experience it, to capture whatever element of rapture that you can find in this landscape, that this is not a landscape that is separate from us. It's part of the development and the landscape. And this just shows it again in these different elements. And it was this interplay. We were interested not just in this idea of creating this kind of perceived natural meandering low flow channel that really may or may not have existed in this case, but we're interested in this idea of playing with that folly of having the organic element on the banks, which you see here, these rock kind of stacked walls, which were organic, but then the bed, instead of it being this meandering low flow form, we were interested in this idea of creating this really geometric form, this really kind of interesting strong lines that tied into this sense of like we were creating not just a river, but this space of something created, something designed, this idea of gardens and this idea of formal geometric gardens that you see more in garden spaces rather than a waterway. It was this reflection, I guess, on the folly of us designing this space, this natural space. And again, this is just this example, this showing it in a different form, this idea of these low flow channels, these geometric dry gardens, the geometric wet gardens, low flow and the paths, and pulling it together into something that for us provided our response, a design response to a new future for this waterway. And so that's, I'll end there and pass back to Mel.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Look, I think, you know, we've got probably a minute or two, but what I find interesting is that the developer drove this, and we're just wondering, we've got a question here about the business cases for these natural systems, or was this, you know, what was the business case for the concrete versus the natural, or was it really just driven by a vision of the developer?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there were two components to it. The developer was seeking additional development area in other parts of the development, and as part of that, it was proposing to over a section of other waterway. So in that very kind of Sydney cultural context of developers drive the response to housing, there was certainly an economic element that drove this, and the economic element in this context was very much driven by yield and development yield for the developer. And in doing that, also then realizing that the developer had to give something back in terms of getting X development yield. What did it then see? So that the economic driver for this was very much a development driven one, and very much of its social and cultural context for Sydney and development in Sydney.
It's fascinating. How long has it been in the ground?
These pictures you see here at 2020, and it was constructed during 2018. So it's been 5 years. So this is 2 years after it was constructed, these photos.
Oh, I think it's inspiration for the rest of us. Just having a natural system in suburbia is quite phenomenal, really. So, congratulations to everybody involved.